Welcome everybody to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about key success factors for implementing a successful 360 feedback program into your workforce. My name is Teresa Strickland. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in just a moment. I first wanted to thank Seven Geese, our sponsor, for bringing this topic to all of you and inviting you to participate. We definitely invite questions. If you have questions, you'll enter them into the question box on your computer, and we will save some time at the end of our program for Q&A, and what we don't get to, we certainly will follow up and make sure that we respond. I find that throughout the program there'll be a lot of questions that do surface. If you don't enter it into the system, certainly make a note, write it down so that you can add it later when we dedicate time to Q&A. So for all of you that are participating today, we'll definitely get some follow-up to you. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Teresa Strickland. I'm a certified leadership coach through IPEC International, which is a globally recognized leader in coaching certification programs, and also some tools that include 360s and behavioral assessments. I'm also an HR advisor to startup and high-growth organizations and do a lot of work with 360s in my coaching practice. My prior background includes holding executive and leadership positions in HR, primarily with startups and high-growth organizations, where I was accountable for everything from talent acquisition, talent management, all of people operations and culture. So in all of those areas, I've actually, in every company that I've worked with 360. So I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences with you, and we'll draw from that experience to share the insights. I always like to set an intention when presenting, and today my intention is really to share my passion with all of you about delivering thoughtful and engaging ideas to help with employee development. So before we begin, I do like to, encourage the audience to participate in this process. And I have a polling question that we would like to start with so that I can get to know a little bit about all of you and your experience working with 360s. So I'm going to launch a question for us. And hopefully you can all see that. There we go. Okay, so the question is, have you implemented 360 feedback into your workplace? There are some options there for you. Yes, across your organization. Yes, limited to a few people or positions within the company. No, but have had vendors use them, like third parties, coaches with some of your employees. And no, but I want to learn more about 360. So I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds before I close. We're getting a lot of good responses. Thank you for participating. Just a few more seconds. We're still getting some input. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll at this time. We've gotten, 80% responses. Let me see if I can share those responses with you. Okay, so 25% of you, yes, have included them across the organization. 20% have implemented them on a limited basis, sometimes with managers or high potential employees or executives, I imagine. 3% have not, but have used them with vendors, and 53% no, but I want to learn more. So this is great. Thank you for participating. That really will help me kind of establish the mindset for my discussion going forward. We do have a lot of content to cover, so I'll go ahead and continue with our presentation. So let's take a look at let me close that poll out for us. Okay, so before I share the agenda with you, I'd like to just get us all on the same page because there's about 50% of us that have not used feedback, 360 feedback, with a quick definition of what it is. And there's a lot of different definitions, but there's some common denominators. The 360 feedback process allows multiple raters, such as supervisors, peer groups, direct reports, external raters such as clients or vendors or sometimes even board members, and the individual themselves to provide feedback on an employee's skills and competencies. The feedback is often used as a benchmark within the employee's development plan or part of an overall performance management process, depending on the organization's purpose and size and how they choose to utilize the tool. And the key here is it's multi-rater feedback. So let's take a look at kind of the focus of our agenda in the context of 360 feedback. And we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the feedback, how they're implemented and how they're being used in today's workforce, the upsides of 360, the value that they add for our employees and organizations, certainly why 360 programs fail and how to mitigate some risks. There's a number of debates and questions that surface when planning and implementing 360 feedback, so we'll talk about some of those. We'll then look at success factors for designing and implementing 360s, and then actionable design and execution tips. We'll wrap up with a quick summary and some Q&A time. So let's take, the concept of how 360 feedback assessments are commonly used in the workplace today. And there's a lot of different uses, and again, some of you may have just used them for a portion of your population, others may have shared across the organization. But leadership development was traditionally used to give executives and later managers feedback that was benchmarked with known leadership competencies, such as goal setting, envisioning, delegation, strategy, alignment, and a lot of the leadership competencies were based on years of research for best leadership practices. So as a leadership development tool, it's been effective and in place for a long time. In regards to performance management, 360s can be used as a component of a performance management system. I often get the question, oh, can we just do 360s as, for our performance appraisals? And, certainly you could look at that, but I like to think about 360s as a component of a larger system. It might be one way to receive feedback, but when we consider it as an appraisal or tied to salary or promotion or those sort of things, then we have to have some sort of a scoring or a percentage of how do we take in that information to apply it to whether it's a promotion or salary increase, or really how does it affect the individual. So for performance management, we do see it used in a lot of larger organizations to help with sometimes what we call ranking or ratings to put people in a certain level of the organization in order to have additional input for the review process. Employee development, career development, this is often employee-driven as well as employer-driven, but it becomes optional when employees are seeking how to grow. They typically would love feedback from peers, and people want to know how they're doing in general. And most commonly today, we're seeing a lot of employees and employers take advantage of this kind of a tool from a career development perspective and how to improve in their current position as well as what skills they need to build for the future. Peer feedback is very popular today. We see peer feedback in goal management systems and performance management systems. There's a lot of opportunity to get peer feedback. So again, today's flatter organizations that are more collaborative and team-oriented, we definitely see peers giving feedback on how they can improve and how they're doing. which is really nice because traditionally it was we would get input from the supervisor, but the supervisor isn't always there to see and experience what we're doing across the organization. Team development, this team development is very powerful because it helps align teams to organizational goals and core competencies that are important to that team. And in a team-focused atmosphere, 360-degree feedback surveys can be very, very effective. It lets the employees know how his or her team members are expected to perform, as well as how they are performing and how others are viewing their effectiveness that's aligned with the core competencies or values that they've set for that team. In my work, I often see 360s in the team development perspective used with customer success or service departments where vendor and customer feedback is included. So that's where we go to some external resources. Also, if you have an internal service team that has internal customers and are trying to meet certain values and commitments to them, we see team development a valuable tool when using 360. And then, of course, coaching programs for leaders. I see 360 feedback as a component of high potential programs now, so those high potential employees that we want to develop for future leadership roles. And then peer coaching programs. I recently implemented and doing a number of talks on implementing peer coaching in the workplace, and that's really a very helpful tool if the team and the peers that are looking for development choose to participate in that. So a lot of different ways. And no matter how you're working with 360s or who they are serving, before launching a program, it's really important to look at, why it adds value to the organization and some of the upsides of 360 feedback. Self-awareness is probably the number one thing. That greater self-awareness really inspires and motivates people to make a change if the feedback is delivered with good intentions. I often do 360 feedback with clients. I do a lot of debriefs. I work for I support the Manager Academy program out at Stanford University, and they have a complete manager leadership development program that consists of a series of lectures, 4 days of classroom work, and a coaching component. In that coaching component, we do 360 feedback. I go in and I work with the individual participant on the debrief of that 360 feedback program, on the development plan, and ongoing coaching. And self-awareness is so powerful. So when I ask my participants, and when I go in and meet with them to do the debrief, the first thing I ask is, tell me about how you felt when you received that feedback. And they're so empowered. They feel really thankful and appreciative of the feedback and the way it was delivered. They find surprises. Sometimes they're surprised that their peers and supervisor are rating them much higher than they rated themselves. We see a lot of hidden strengths surface. We see gaps or soft spots where they think they're doing better than they are actually being perceived in terms of their performance. And it's a great awareness tool because it's not coming from one individual, but we start to see patterns, and those patterns speak very loudly. So that self-awareness is so critical to driving motivation and change for individuals to move forward. Certainly improved feedback is a definite improvement over feedback from a single individual. Again, we recognize patterns, and the perceptions of coworkers is really important and valued among employees today. And lastly, I think because of the multi-rated feedback, there's less energy spent on giving the feedback because it's supported by multiple raters, and we have the opportunity to look at multiple competencies versus just trying to figure out what's the most important thing to convey when giving feedback. So certainly we talked a little bit about enhancing team development and communication, and I really believe that when we align it with our company mission and strategy and goals, we also reinforce our organizational goals in that process and the communication of those and what's expected. So, great pluses for both team development and just alignment across the organization. 360 feedback inspires personal, professional, and career development. And it really needs to be delivered in the context of development and with good intention. If we do not deliver the program, and we'll talk about this in a thoughtful manner, it can be a really scary process for people. But if delivered appropriately, it can be very inspiring, and then it reinforces the employee development, their own goals, and aligns with organizational goals to make that happen. And ultimately, greater employee engagement is derived from that, which, as we all know, drives productivity, employee happiness, all of the above. So it's a great tool, especially when trying to align your teams to your core values and the competencies that are expected in that role. So for every positive point I just made, there's a lot of detractors too. And the downside is important to look at because it gives you a roadmap of what to avoid, when you implement 360 and feedback into your workplace. And one of the key things is, I see this happen a lot, and that is the failure to connect your program to strategic goals. What is the leadership framework you're trying to accomplish, or what is the development program that you're trying to put in place for employees? How are you trying to support them? How does it align with your company mission? It's really, really important. If we can't connect the program with a real purpose that's meaningful to the target audience or the group that we're implementing this with, we have a high likelihood of failing. So it's really important to be clear about your purpose, why you're doing this, what the expected outcomes are, and we'll take a look at many of those issues as we continue on in the discussion. The other point I'd like to make about, connecting the program to strategic goals is, I can't tell you how often, somebody has come to me, a leader, an exec, or even HR has decided that, somebody had a great experience with this, now we should roll it out to the rest of the organization. And just because one person had a good experience or thought it was really helpful for them doesn't necessarily be helpful for everybody. It is a very time-consuming process. It takes a lot of commitment on yourself, employees, to implement this process. So it's very, very important to make sure that you've got some alignment with your strategic goals. Insufficient communication and training. You'll hear me talk a lot about this because communication and training throughout the process is important. But I think the point that I want to make here is, because most 360-degree feedback is anonymous, participants don't always have any recourse for further clarification or understanding of the feedback. Certainly, we can have open-ended questions and there's rating systems, but at the end of the day, if it's anonymous, the idea is that they don't really know the context of every comment or all the data coming in. So basically, they have no one to ask for clarification about unclear comments or information. What we can do about this is we can develop what I call 360 process coaches within your organization. That can be supervisors, HR staff members. It might just be training your team on how to debrief people so that they can look at the data that they've gathered in a way that's going to be helpful versus really picking on one thing that's really hit them deeply in terms of concern. So communication and training is going to be important. Poor planning process and also with design flaws. If we are not planning, we're going to miss some really key steps. So we're going to spend more time on this, and I'll outline some of those steps. Design flaws I reference because if we are implementing 360 across the organization and we use the same tool or the same questions for all levels of the organization, when we come across how do you motivate your team, and I don't have a team, that's not going to resonate well with me. So sometimes we need to think about, the questions, how we design the tools, who our target audience is, and so forth. So being very thoughtful in that planning process is important. Rater inexperience and ineffectiveness. There's numerous ways rater information can go wrong. Raters might inflate things to make an employee look good, or alternatively, maybe not look so good. People might feel concerned that if they say things or write down things, that it could affect one's salary or potential for increase if it's part of an appraisal system. And they don't know how to give feedback. So again, we need to help them. We need to train and teach and help them with best practices. The other piece is, just yesterday I was doing a debrief with one of my clients, and we have 2 open-ended questions in our survey that we use at Stanford. And one of the questions is, what is this person doing really well? What could they do better? I don't think that's the exact phrase, but so you always hear all these great things. They're doing wonderful. They communicate well. They align the team well. I feel really like I have an open communication. Like all these great things. And then when we say how can they improve, instead of really being specific about how they can improve or to help them, because the intent is for development here, they often will say, I can't think of anything, and they'll just talk about more strengths. And when that feedback, although it's really nice, gets to the employee, it doesn't really help them determine what kind of actions to take, how to improve. Certainly we want to look at what we do well, and we want to continue to do that, but so we need to be really thoughtful about how can we really ask the right questions to get more effective answers, and how can we train our employees about the intention of what we're trying to accomplish and how they can really be helping their fellow employees when providing, good input versus all great things, and so forth. So lastly, survey or being overworked. Maybe there's a huge workload in your organization. I work with a lot of startups. Like, time to do a survey can be exhausting, or when I have to do 4 of them because there's 4 executives that need survey input. We have to be really careful. So you need to think about your organizational readiness from a time perspective. Can you ask multiple raters to take time out of their schedule, prioritize this feedback, and complete a survey or an instrument or a tool? I also think survey length is really important. I actually did a 360 feedback assessment for one of my CEOs not that long ago, and the tool was put together by a coach, a third-party coach, and I think that there was 60 questions in this survey, and they were not only rated questions, but they had a lot of open-ended comments. It took me an hour and a half on a Sunday to get it done, and by the time I got to the end of the survey, I couldn't remember what I wrote earlier. So really think about the instrument, the survey length, how much time it's going to absorb of your team, because if people don't have time, they don't fill out the surveys, the process can fail. And then certainly if there's no action plan or accountability or follow-up, having clarity around the next steps is really critical to a successful program. So we covered a lot, but I also want to talk about some kind of key debates or questions that come up typically in the planning process of building a 360 program. And I can't claim to cover every discussion that comes up, but I highlighted a few. And one is when we look at the goal. Why are we doing this? Is it for development or for appraisal? And that is a big question that ends up having a lot of discussion, because if it's appraisal, it means it typically has an outcome that's either tied to salary or promotion, or maybe it's already been benchmarked and now we're looking if there's been improvement. If there hasn't, it could affect an employee. So we need to be really clear about what is our intention here when designing 360 feedback programs. In terms of methodology, the big question is, should the feedback be anonymous? Or, should we have known coworkers' feedback? Or is it a combination of these? And typically what I find in the majority of tools out there is that it is confidential, because that really allows for honest, open feedback. And the only person that isn't confidential typically is the manager or supervisor that's completing the tool. In order to maintain it to be anonymous, we usually need 3 or more people to give input in a certain group. So whether it's a peer group or, direct report group. If I have 5 direct reports and only 2 people filled it out, those 2 responses would typically get grouped with others or peers. We always try to maintain some sense of confidentiality around this because it's so powerful. But again, there are companies that I know that are very specific about it's okay to share. We have very transparent, open communication. We want people to be honest and helpful. When you have completely open feedback like that, however, it's important that we teach people how to give and receive feedback. So around methodology, you need to think about, is it anonymous? How do we make it anonymous? And then also, who picks the employees who provide feedback? Best practice here is to give guidelines to the employees. It should be people that they are working with, not their best friends. Oftentimes we try to pick people from our peers or other people across the department that we work with. We look at our direct reports, if we have direct reports. If it's a peer program and we have no direct reports, it might be customers, vendors, it could be other managers, people from different departments. But allowing the individual participant to kind of choose who, they really know best who can give them the right feedback, who knows their work. If we look at process, I think this is a big question. Who owns the data? Does the individual own the data from the feedback, or the organization, including the manager, having access? And this is important. I have found it to be very successful that the data really should be owned by the employee if it's for them. Out at Stanford, the only people that actually see the debrief report is myself as the coach and the individual participant. If the participant decides to share the entire report with their manager, they certainly can do that, but the manager doesn't have access to that without the employee's permission. And typically what I find is most people will just summarize and share with their manager because at a certain point they want to work with their manager to put a development plan together. But do think about kind of the process around who owns that data. The outcome, big question around the outcome that's very controversial is, do feedback results impact salary increases or not? And if not, that's okay. It's really probably most focused on the intention of development versus appraisal. And if it does impact salary or a promotion, we need to be very clear about defining how does it impact and what percentage of this data and information is being considered as a component or part of the overall process. So definitely that's a big question that has, stimulates a lot of discussion. Tool selection, we need to think about design, implementation, and reporting. Is it self-developed versus off-the-shelf? The amazing thing about 360s today is they're much more available to us, and they're much more affordable. They're incorporated into performance management systems sometimes that sit in our organization now. We can customize them and build them based on the support of systems, whether they're goal management systems like a 7 Geese or more complex scalable performance management systems, or standalone tools, right, kind of off the shelf through various vendors out there. So it is important to kind of look at what's available. I think certainly, is it computerized? It should be with technology today. However, I have small organizations that use a simple spreadsheet instrument or use a Google questionnaire. And the key is when we're using our homegrown systems, we need to make sure that we're maintaining confidential information carefully if, in fact, we've told people that it's going to be anonymous. And when we are a small organization and we are using these homegrown tools, definitely, really few people should have access to that data. It might be the participant, a manager, and, the administrator of that program. Maybe it's just the participant and the administrator. Again, depends on kind of the goal and method that you choose. So tool selection is important. And lastly, organizational readiness. Organizational readiness from the perspective of your culture. What is the current climate in your culture, in your organization? You need to decide if it's one of trust and cooperation, or does the climate need a little bit of work to build out that kind of trust and cooperation and transparency? I have a client that I work with today. There are 40 employees. There's a CEO and 6 managers who run their departments. The managers all really would love to have a 360 program. They want feedback. They want to see how they're doing as managers because they're, for the most part, new managers. So I spoke with the CEO about it, and he just was not supportive of the tool for a number of reasons after further digging. But his organization wasn't ready for this because he wasn't ready to really be applying some of the leadership competencies that were going to be important to his team members. He's an entrepreneur, a visionary, very smart, but sometimes our CEOs don't necessarily always have really well-developed leadership competencies. So we need to work on building out what those are within the organization before the organization is ready. So hopefully you're all doing okay. We're going to get into the key success factors for implementing 360 feedback. And some of this is going to sound redundant, but I think that it's really important. And the first thing we need to look at is management alignment and accountability. This is so key. If the managers are not bought in, or your key stakeholders don't want to do this, they won't support the process. They might support it or say, yay, that's a good idea, but then when suddenly their team needs to prioritize some time to complete surveys, and we need to start making time to do debriefs with our employees and putting development plans together and following up on those things. If we're not bought in and we don't have that support of leadership, we definitely are at risk of the program potentially losing its gusto and potentially failing. So management alignment is really important just with any change management strategy. We need to have a clear purpose. Why are we doing this? How will it tie into your strategy for people development or performance management? Does it align with the values tied to the culture, mission, and vision? Sometimes it may, sometimes it may not. I've had just departments look at 360s for team development, and they have their own vision within what they want to convey to their customers and vendors and the people that they work with. And so, as long as they're really clear about what they want, and then that department head is communicating and making sure that if we're getting feedback across the organization, that we're going to seek the support of those across the organization. So we, again, have to look at, what is the exposure here for us? And if you have that management alignment and a clear purpose, you're likely to be much more successful. I think when we think about process and methodology, we need to answer, what are we doing? How are we going to do it? Who serves, who are we serving? These questions are all really, really important, because if we don't answer them, we will miss key things, or the program won't be as successful. And I'll share with you, not everybody loves 360 feedback. It makes people, it instills fear in an organization sometimes if it's not delivered properly. So really important to define that process, and then certainly communicate, train, and educate. And I can't emphasize this enough on all aspects of the program. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But it is important because if you've ever seen the face of somebody that learned that they were going to have 360 feedback and they weren't sure what that meant, and they're like, oh my gosh, is that going to affect my job? What's that mean to me? I'm really nervous about the feedback. When I go into debrief conversations with clients, I always ask them, were there any surprises? And they said, oh, and I was really nervous about getting this, and I was, I lost sleep last night, and they do get very nervous. So again, how we can communicate and help people understand our purpose and the intent of it, and that we're going to look at patterns, and then we're going to focus on things that are important to them, because that's where they'll be motivated to make change. You need to train and educate all participants on the following: goals, process, time frames, expected outcomes, how to give and receive feedback. It's very, very critical that you're thinking about all components of the program in that planning stage. So once you launch your 360, you need to define the next steps. The feedback's in, what's next? And this may take a different shape for different size of organizations, depending on how we put our plans into place. Do we do feedback debriefs? Who does that? Who's responsible for that? How is that done? I'll use the example at Stanford. When we do a debrief, the first thing that happens is a survey link goes out to the participants, and they get this kind of video on, because it's a large audience that we're working with, but they get a video that says how to assess their information and read their report. Their reports are like 40-page reports, and they have texts and graphs and all sorts of data and tips and competency levels and so forth. So it's pretty complex. So we send that link to them, and then I usually meet with them within 24, 48 hours of them receiving that feedback. And when I meet with them, they say, oh, I looked at the link, but gosh, it was so much. I was just looking forward to talking with you. So, but people learn in different ways. So we need to think about how are we going to set up that debrief. I also, I was working with a company where I was working with executives, and the debrief, I actually got on a 15-minute call before I even sent them the report. And I talked them through what to expect when they received the information. Not the outcome of the information, but just how to digest this information and not to read too much into it. And so I would debrief them on the phone, and then I would send them the report, and then I would meet with them within 24 to 48 hours following that. So there's lots of different approaches. If we're a small organization and we've got our managers trained to do the debriefs, that's okay too. It's just all about that training. Coaching. Coaching is really important, and again, it's a form of communication. It's how we approach this conversation in the debrief. How do we coach for improvement? Sometimes people have feedback that's not so good, and there's a lot of opportunity for development. Often I see this with new managers. They're now managing their peers and their friends, and suddenly, they move to a management role, but they never put on a management hat, and they haven't done, any alignment with their team. They haven't set goals. They're not communicating. Things are just as they were. So once in a while, we get some feedback that really doesn't necessarily feel good, because there's a lot of room for growth. But again, how we coach and help that person recognize where they're at in their position, their career, the opportunity for learning, etc., is really important. So there's a lot of guidance that you can get around how to coach your employees through the process and next steps. Another next step, you need to determine if there's a development plan or what actions are your employees going to take once they have this feedback. We've invested a lot of time and energy, and if we don't have an action plan or clear about what they can do with this data, we're in a situation then where, again, the program could fail because people aren't doing anything with it. The CEO I referenced earlier who didn't want to do this had a 360 in the past and found like that he just was not in a position to do it because he had an experience where they went through all this, he learned some information, but there was no action or follow-up. So again, I don't know if I'll ever be able to implement 360s there, but that was important. So we need to look at a different approach for their leadership development. Creating a tool for the development plan. So whatever you're doing with your action steps, you need to create some tools for people. You can't just go say, oh, go write a development plan. We see this. I know that 7 Geese and other goal management systems have development plans, actual tools that they can use. So you need to determine what strategies, resources, and support can be applied to their development. Sometimes we do 360 for leadership development, and then we don't utilize plans, but we actually put a leadership framework together and we start training for that. So we always have to have the accountability plan tied to whatever actions that we have and who's going to drive that, how are we going to check in, and then certainly, you know, monitoring the program and celebrating successes is really important. Lots of recognition through this process because it's a big undertaking. And it's big for employees to be able to drive change, especially when, you know, that hasn't been their choice to participate in a program in some cases. Okay, we're almost close. The assessment design, I think it's important. We talked about build or buy, lots of opportunities. You know, I've used tools like Custom Insights. I know that 7 Geese has a 360 tool or peer feedback assessments tools. There's many tools out there. Stanford uses the Booth survey. I could name a number. You're welcome to reach out to me if you want information on any of those. The key here in around the assessment design, this is the actual tool, instrument, or survey. We needed to identify performance competencies. What is your culture value? What are the expected norms and behaviors? Is teamwork, collaboration? Do we want our managers aligning their teams through goal setting? Like, what is it we expect? And we need to make sure that we are measuring against the competencies that are a part of our organization. And if you're a small organization and you haven't defined those competencies, that's okay. That's where you want to step back and get alignment and ask your leaders, what is most important? What do we value? And there's values like innovation and always learning, and those sort of things really tie in nicely to these development tools. We want to define differences by level of position. So again, you know, if you have managers and individual contributors taking the same, you know, tool or answering the same questions, it might not make sense to be asking, you know, about goal alignment questions with their team when they don't have a team, etc. So we need to be sensitive to that. These off-the-shelf tools and even the goal management systems or performance management systems that have 360s in them, they often have templates and support that can be provided to get clarity around level of positions and questions so you can customize them. Sometimes we want to get specific competencies within a position. That's very difficult to do from the perspective of larger organizations. We can do that within the context of team development, might be more appropriate. But again, this is a choice that you have. We want to compose questions that are supporting all of the above, as well as thinking thoughtfully about our rating system or how we're asking questions. But there's many templates out there available to you. I do want to just mention that including quantitative and qualitative questions is a plus. I do not encourage 45 open-ended questions. It goes faster and you get just as good a data with questions that are rated questions. We see things that are rating from low, average, average, high. So there's number ratings, lots of different options you'll see in the marketplace. I don't think a 1 to 10 rating scale is always effective because people, you know, 5 feels like a high number to some people. It's average to other people. I think at Stanford we use 1 to 7. But needless to say, the results show results as low, low average, average, average high, and high. In terms of open-ended questions, there are 2 questions that I highly recommend that you ask, and I'll share them with you. One is, what does this person do that is effective? This is really important. It's not, oh, what do they do well, but what do they do that's really effective? Because people like to think about, oh, you know, they really, that word makes people think about, like, what one is doing well. How does it affect them, and so forth. And that's really, it draws a lot of strength. So we have an opportunity to see how people, and open-ended questions, you give plenty of space so that people can respond to that. The second question, and it should follow right after what that person does, is what behaviors could this person develop that would make them more effective? What behaviors could this person develop that would make them more effective? Because now we're really driving the intention for improvement. And we don't really want somebody to say, well, I already said they're really great and I can't think of anything. So we want to ask questions that are going to, like, help people get to the information that's going to be helpful for that participant. Open-ended questions come back in the tabulation and reports as pretty lengthy data. So you can limit your text box size for response. However, most people will put in a paragraph or 2, and it can be really, really valuable information because it often highlights some examples, and people are really good at you know, providing some clarity, which is helpful to the participant. The last thing I want to say here is really you should pilot the survey. This doesn't mean we pilot the survey across the organization, but take the survey yourself, or have a few stakeholders, managers or participants that might, you know, take a look at some of the questions for you. They will have input. We don't need to take everybody's input, but it is a really good idea to make sure that you actually, you know, I've looked at tons of surveys, but when I actually take the survey and fill it out, I start to have different responses. So it's a great practice to do that. Delivery logistics tips. Leadership messaging is super important. Here's my suggestion. Get your CEO or your department head or your VP or whoever's supporting this program to send out an email. You know, we are launching, you know, our team or our HR department or whoever's responsible is launching a survey for 360 feedback. This is the purpose of it. We are going to ask, you know, if you receive an email to participate in this process, you know, please take time out of your day and make it a priority to complete this. That messaging can be really, really important. You want to establish and publish a timeline for everything, like when we're launching, when the feedback needs to be in by, when do we send the reports to the individual participants, when do we have the debrief, how soon do we want them to have a development plan, how often do we do check-ins. That whole timeline needs to be clear for your participants. We need to be clear on expectations, and that's through training and educating all participants, the participant getting feedback, the managers, the raters, everybody. And then you execute your plan. You can check in on it. Sometimes you need follow-up and reminders. And then you also have to follow up on participant next steps. So what I've done here to just wrap up before we go to Q&A is I've got 360-degree feedback process overview. And this is really, the survey is launched, you've done your work, what happens? So we collect the data to tabulate and summarize in a confidential manner. You're going to have to know, you can look at your tool to figure out how you're going to do that. And if you're designing it within your own organization and your own tool, these are things you need to think about. But the data is in, it gets collected, we have a debrief with the employee. We need to determine how do we share the information, what happens in the debrief discussion, who's involved, who does the debrief, how do we communicate that? If it's a development plan discussion that we're having, we need to establish action plan and accountability. When is it done by? Who's working with that individual? Do we have manager check-ins? And so on. I think it's optional, but I like to share this, it is okay for people that have participated in this process to thank and share the results with the raters. And I'm not sharing the results like, oh, here's my report and all the details, but just to be able to say, hey, really appreciated you taking time out to complete the survey. I've got a lot of good feedback. I learned that I'm doing this well, and I'm really focusing on improving in these areas. And here's some of the changes that I'm going to be making, and I appreciate your support. Really, really powerful, and also it shows value for the time that people put in to complete the survey. So check in on development plan, progress. We want to acknowledge, validate the employee and the team's progress. That's that follow-through piece. And then we monitor and assess. Sometimes with leaders, we re-administer 360s to assess for improvement. That's where it becomes a benchmark for later development. Minimum time frame 6 months to 1 year. We also can get feedback based on culture survey, how our employees are aligned with our mission, the business norms and behaviors, through performance observed. There's a lot of ways to assess and acknowledge that. So to wrap up, we're going to go to Q&A, but it's really important that careful planning and communication takes place. It's successful for your program. You want to ensure alignment and support from leaders. Start with the why. Figure out how you're going to do it, what you're going to do, what tools you're going to do, who's it serving, who needs to take what action. Communicate, train, monitor, and then assess if it's working. It is a time-consuming process, and if it's not working, that is okay. It doesn't always work for everybody. So let's take some questions. We have some time to take some questions. I'll leave you with this comment. Think of feedback as a gift with good intentions. Be mindful in your approach to ensure success in the program. Apply effective change management strategies to planning and implementation, and do things right, and you will add a really powerful tool to your employee development kit. So I'm going to open up some questions. We've got Q&A time, and then I'll certainly, I have some contact information. Feel free to enter any questions. If we don't have time to get to all of the questions, we will certainly do a follow-up and respond to your questions. So can we obtain a copy of the slide deck at the end of the presentation? Yes, one will be shared with all of the registrants. We've got that. Thank you. With the trend towards a more casual work environment and movement away from formal appraisals, talk about acceptance of 360s today. Great question. It is much more acceptable. People want feedback. We have much flatter organizations today, much more team-oriented, much more distributed, and people want to know how they can be more successful at their own jobs, at supporting others, at working with others. So really, really important to look at, again, that climate of your culture, but the trend is definitely more this. I'm also seeing trends as we have seen in performance management, with more ongoing discussions and check-ins around goals and alignment of goals, both from a professional job-related goals and personal career development goals. So definitely we see that. I have another question. When using the 7 Geese 360 feedback feature, our response is anonymous. Do you recommend a manager compiling and summarizing feedback and giving the raw data feedback to employee? Yes, they can be. They've got administrators or managers. They have resources and an advisor that can help you with that. So that is available to you. Again, it's just how you're choosing to administer, but they definitely have the opportunity to provide anonymous response. Great. Well, if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. We covered a lot of information and data. And certainly 7 Geese is available to support you with questions that they have. And my contact information was provided earlier and will be on your slides. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Really appreciate your time. I will stay on line just a few more minutes for any additional questions that come in. And so if there's any other questions, I'll go ahead and respond. I do want to say thank you again to May at Seven Geese, who coordinated and got us all together today. Really appreciate all of your attention and support, and hopefully you'll be able to implement a really engaging program that will add value to your organization. Thank you all. So I've been asked to put my contact information on the screen again, and I will do that. I'm having difficulty doing that, but it's coming. We just went to, I think the slide passed itself. My slide is not going backwards, so I'm unable to get that. But again, my name is Teresa Strickland. I am happy to invite you to link in with me on LinkedIn. The contact information is in the deck that will be sent out to all of you. You can also find information about my organization at stricklandhradvisory.com. And there you'll learn a little bit about my coaching and HR advisory practices. And certainly if I can help any of you, I'm happy to do so. Okay, we are at the top of the hour. So I'll just stay on the line a couple more minutes for any additional questions. And there is my contact information. So if anybody is still on the line and would like to have my contact information, it is there. I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. And certainly if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to myself, or if you are a user of Seven Geese or have information that you'd like to talk with them about, we're all available here to support you. Enjoy your day. We'll be closing out the seminar.